Hello there. Welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. As ever, I'm Lucy Steigerwald, and today is a pretty cool guest, I'm pretty sure. We have Victoria Law, and I will read her bio. Victoria Law is a journalist and author who writes about incarceration, resistance, and gender. Her most recent book, out of a couple of other ones, is Corridors of Contagion, How the Pandemic Exposed the Cruelties of Incarceration. And her most recent piece was titled "We've Entered the Gaslighting Phase of COVID in Prisons in the Nation," which is definitely an issue that nobody talked about at the time enough and probably doesn't talk about now. But I welcome Victoria.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for covering these kinds of issues, even though nobody wants to talk about them.
Well, we do, unfortunately. I guess to start off, though, could you describe your politics, if I demanded to know?
Yes. Well, my politics are definitely leftist, definitely radical, um, more or less anarchist, although I do things like go vote in elections, and that kind of a thing. But definitely geared more towards mutual aid and abolitionist, which is looking at not just tearing down the physical structures of jails and prisons and immigrant prisons, but also like building resources and communities so that way we don't have so many people. Our response to poverty and violence and sexism and misogyny, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, isn't just funneling people into cages of one type or another.
Well, I'm going to definitely ask you about abolitionism and what that means to you. But did you have any kind of political journey or change over the years?
Over the years?
Mm-hmm. Over your whole entire life, but
Okay. I mean,
shorten it if you want.
yeah. I came to prison looking at issues of incarceration in high school when I was in what we would now call a school to prison pipeline school. But back when I was in high school, there was no such terminology. It was just the high school that Black, brown, and immigrant kids were shuttled into. I grew up in New York City. I still live in New York City. When I was growing up, you just went to the high school that you were zoned for. Like if you lived here between these streets and these streets, you went to that high school. If you lived between these streets and that streets, you went to a different high school. And people who had more resources, whether they be financial resources or even just what we call social capital, meaning that you knew people who lived in areas that were zoned for better schools, would borrow addresses to enroll their kids in the better school. So what ends up happening is people without those resources end up sending their kids to the school that they're zoned for. So mine was a school that was Black, brown, immigrant, low income. It was overcrowded, and it was the perfect recruiting ground for gangs. And when you are a teenager, particularly a low income teenager, and you see your parents or parent, in many cases, really struggling to pay rent, put food on the table, put clothes on your back, put clothes on your siblings' back, and never getting a break. And then somebody comes to you and says, "How'd you like to make a few $100s every night?" Uh, Many of my friends said yes. They joined gangs, they dropped out of school, and eventually got arrested for gang related activities. And in New York City, we have a cash bail system where a judge says, a prosecutor says, this person is a danger to society. You must keep them locked up. But if you're not going to keep them locked up, make their family pay, some ungodly amount of money in order to bail them out while they await trial. And their families didn't have a lot of money, which is why they joined gangs and, were arrested. So they ended up going to Rikers Island. And that was my first encounter with incarceration, was, going to Rikers Island. And if you ever go to visit somebody at a jail, especially at Rikers Island, you go and you put all your stuff in a locker and then you just wait. And sometimes you wait for hours. Um, and you're not allowed to do anything. It's not like the dentist waiting room where at least there's a television or magazines. You just sit there
Mhm.
and you can't bring your phone, you can't bring anything. We didn't even have cell phones back then. So, but there was nothing to do but to talk to the people around you. So I ended up striking up conversations with other women who were uh, regular visitors who I saw several times a week. And from there, they were talking about how, they were visiting their menfolk, their husbands, their brothers, their sons, and everybody's story was basically a story of this person lacked opportunities in some ways. There was no Jeffrey Dahmer, there was no Bernie Madoff, nobody was a serial killer, nobody was making Ponzi schemes to devastate people's bank accounts. These were all just people who didn't have many opportunities and grabbed illegal opportunities and got caught. And from there, I wanted to know, well, what is the system that I am suddenly enmeshed in. And so I went to uh, a local bookstore, and there was a whole section of books about prisons, and they were abolitionist in nature, but they talked about the fact that incarceration is a racist classist system, that it is designed to, basically sweep up the people whom Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls disposable, that society calls disposable. Not that Ruth Wilson Gilmore sees them as disposable, but people who are usually modestly educated, people who don't have a lot of opportunities. And everything that I was reading fit with what I saw in those waiting rooms and in those visiting rooms, both when my friends were at Rikers and when they eventually struck plea bargains in which they pled guilty in exchange for a lesser sentence than if they had gone to trial and failed, because then they would be facing much longer sentences.
Mhm.
And then I would go visit them in prisons and I would send them books and they would tell me about what was going on inside the jails and the prisons. So that was my introduction to incarceration. And that was what made me kind of set me on the trajectory of later on writing about not only conditions behind bars, but also what people were doing about what was going on behind bars. So not just having, at the time I think it was like 1 million something people sitting on their hands and just enduring injustices and oppression, but also what they were doing about that. And later on I really focused on what incarcerated women were doing to challenge and change these conditions, because at the time nobody was looking at this particular population, even though they were the fastest growing segment behind bars.
There's so much I want to talk about in reference to what you just said, but can you talk a little bit about you went to the bookstore, kind of some other names or other things you read that put you on this path, or anyone you knew, for anarchism and prison abolition too.
Yes. So I went to the bookstore. It was St. Mark's Bookstore in the East Village.
Mm.
And they had a section on prisons. And again, it was like mostly prison abolition. So I think I read Daniel Burton Rose's The Selling of America, Celling. So, like how are people, being incarcerated? So when my friends were getting incarcerated, it was shortly before Bill Clinton and Congress signed the 1994 Violent Crime Bill.
Ah,
So the thing
yeah.
is, my friends were, so some of it is a little bit of an overlap and like a jumble in my mind as to which came, what books came before and which books came after the crime bill. But really, so people weren't really looking at incarceration. There was still this idea that we had to lock people up, for really long times to keep society safe. And my friends were caught up in that dragnet of, to use a problematic gender term, the hysteria around crime, the crime panic. Of the time where the police were empowered to do all sorts of things. There was a lot of money being thrown into arrests, policing arrests, incarceration, and as I saw in my high school, really not a lot of resources being poured into education, after school programs for people who perhaps were pushed out of high school, you know. So actually, so like now that I think about it, like those original texts might be kind of jumbled with what came after the crime bill when more people were looking at, like, hey, wait a minute,
Mhm.
we just signed this omnibus bill, which is going to lock more people up for more periods of time, and what does that look like? So I can't really answer that part. But the other thing about St. Mark's Bookstore is that they had flyers on a bulletin board, and I saw a flyer for the Nightcrawler's Anarchist Black Cross. Not to be confused with the current iteration of New York City Anarchist Black Cross, but the Nightcrawler's Anarchist Black Cross was a group of people, mostly living in the South Bronx, who met all the way down in the Lower East Side for I don't know what reason, but which was fine because I probably would not have gone all the way to the South Bronx because it was very far. Um, and we're specifically looking at prison abolition. How do we support folks on the inside, both political prisoners and politicized prisoners? So, for listeners who, might be like, what's the difference? Political prisoners are people who are incarcerated because of their actions tied to their politics. We look at groups from the 1980s and 1990s, like the Weather Underground, or the Black Panther Party, and people who are incarcerated, because of their politics or because of their actions tied to that as political prisoners. Nowadays, it might be people who are defacing those anti-abortion pregnancy centers who get arrested and are prosecuted as political prisoners. And politicized prisoners are people who are incarcerated, not necessarily for crimes tied to any politics. So it might be like a robbery or a burglary or a, home invasion or whatever. And then they get politicized while incarcerated. And there have been numbers of folks throughout the years. I mean, when members of the Weather Underground were incarcerated in New York State prisons, they politicized so many people, around HIV and AIDS, around standing up together, against different prison injustices. And so people became politicized through them. So the Nightcrawlers supported both political prisoners and politicized prisoners, and they did so through a prison abolitionist lens. So I started going to their meetings to be like, well, what can I concretely do?
Mhm.
I have these friends who are incarcerated. I'm sending them books, I'm writing them letters, but is there something kind of more broad that I can do that is not just individualized support? And so I started going to their meetings, listening to what they had to say, participating in some of the things that they were doing as well. And that kind of put me on the trajectory of abolition rather than, say, reform.
Mhm. I definitely want to ask you about that and whether reform is a dirty word to you at all. Because obviously it can be an excuse to not get rid of the prisons, but I'll just say that at the very least, humanely treated kidnapped
Mhm.
victims are better than actively tortured, and all the things that go on now and stuff. But like, it, it was like reform a dangerous kind of road to go down for people,
Yeah.
especially every normie I've
Mhm.
ever seen. I basically.
Mhm. Well, I think that one of the things that I learned early on, and I wish I could remember who, first coined the term, but I don't remember. It might have been Ruth Wilson Gilmore, but it may have been somebody else. Was the idea of non-reformist reforms. So when
Mhm.
looking at a reform, so say looking at prison reform, the questions that should be asked is, will this concretely help people inside? Will this do so in a way that strengthens the carceral apparatus? Does this build new prisons, cages, surveillance, or other mechanisms that we will then have to try to dismantle later? So, in other words, there have been lots of, um, like there's been lots of attention paid in recent years to women's incarceration and how women are often not, like not well treated because the prison system was designed for men
Mm-hmm.
and for young, healthy men. They are not necessarily designed for people who are now turning 80 because we have ridiculously long sentences. But, they're not designed for women. There's, very little uh, reproductive health care.
Mm-hmm.
There is very little, attention being paid to gender specific issues such as menstrual pads, tampons, um, other feminine hygiene items, having male guards in women's prisons has proven highly problematic in terms of sexual harassment and sexual abuse again and again and again. And these are all valid concerns. I think it's something like 3 to 5% of people enter women's jails and prisons pregnant each year.
Yeah.
And and until 1999, no state had any sort of legislation that said thou shalt not shackle a pregnant person while they are in labor. For listeners who don't know what shackling is, imagine any movie you have seen about enslaved people on a chain gang or on a coffle where they are handcuffed, and then there's a chain that leads from the handcuffs to a waist chain. And usually that the handcuffs and the waist chain are pretty much like tight. So if somebody falls, there's not a lot of room to catch themselves. And from that waist chain, there's another chain that leads to their ankles, and their ankles are chained together. And this is how people in prison are transported when they go to court, when they go to outside medical appointments, whenever they are taken off the prison premises or the jail premises. And until 1999, there was no state that made legal exceptions that said, you know what, as a blanket policy, thou shalt not chain pregnant people when they are actively in labor or
Mm-hmm.
while they are delivering their baby or immediately postpartum until 1999. And Illinois became the first because of years of advocacy and organizing and lobbying by currently and formerly incarcerated women who had experienced pregnancy and the barbarity of being chained while they were pregnant and often in labor, delivery, and postpartum recovery. So these are very gender specific things that affect women. And we have very specific things that affect trans people and
Mm-hmm.
gender non-binary people who are in prisons, from them being placed in prisons that don't were in prisons. Let me back up. Prisons and jails are, and immigrant detention centers and all sorts of places are segregated based on a binary. You are
Mm-hmm.
male or female. And jails and prisons often use whatever the person's gender marker is at birth, to decide, like you're going to go to a men's prison or a women's prison. And this has resulted in lots of, and we don't even know how many trans women being put in men's prisons where they experience all sorts of harm and violence, from staff members, from other people, and just from the way that the prison is set up. So a reform that might address these issues is to say, why don't we just build a separate trans prison? But it doesn't look at what are the factors um, that are causing trans people to be incarcerated. And there have been numerous studies that show that trans people have more interactions with law enforcement, are have more arrests than their non-transgender counterparts. And that's not because they are more dangerous or they commit more crimes, but because they have been criminalized and pushed out of so many
Mm-hmm.
other ways in which they can participate in society or be housed in society or whatever. Similarly, looking at women's prison conditions, people might say, well, we should build nicer, quote unquote, trauma informed women's jails and prisons instead of putting them in these one size fits all models. But that pours more money and more resources into building new prisons for trans people, for women, for, fill in the blank. And it doesn't address any of the underlying causes of their incarceration, like laws that allow, laws that criminalize people, lengthy sentences. Many states have what's called felony murder, which is if you are participating in an action which is a felony, such as like a burglary or a robbery, and somebody is killed during the course of this, because a co-defendant, killed them, or because they had a heart attack, or something else happened, or sometimes like a bullet ricochets and kills somebody. You can be charged as if you had pulled the trigger, and you could be sentenced thus so. So there are all sorts of underlying causes as to why we have these ridiculously gigantic populations of people inside. So building new, supposedly nicer cages is a reformist reform. A non-reformist reform might be, how do we start getting people out? Like mass clemency efforts. Clemency being appealing to the governor or the president, depending on whether it's a state or a federal system, to say like please lessen the sentences of, you know, all people serving life without parole. A non-reformist reform might be a court challenge to, like life without parole sentences for, a certain group of people, to say like, I and everybody similarly situated, I and everybody who are convicted and sentenced under the felony murder statute should not be sentenced to life without parole, because this is an unjust law. And, and a victory like that then allows people to petition for their freedom, but does not necessarily say, like, we will build you a new prison for felony murder, or we will build you a new, nicer women's prison because this one is not, is old, outdated, and, doesn't fit your specific needs as X.
I mean, a good rule of thumb should be like, if it starts, we're going to build a new whatever, that makes sense that that's off the table. But I guess like, um, I feel like you would sort of have to be in favor of, say, stop feeding prisoners non-human grade food, which is apparently a thing that happens.
Yes.
And all that, in a way, isn't that spending money on kind of the pouring more money into the criminal justice system in a way, even if you're not like sort of building a fresh new, um, theoretically more humane jail.
Yes, it is pouring money into it. But again, you don't also want to say, you people who are currently inside, so pregnant people inside, just wait,
Mm-hmm.
until we have figured out the magical solution so that pregnant people can no longer be incarcerated. It is, like being like, how do people survive long enough so that way, like we can, while we figure out the mechanisms to get people out, and to also not have people be funneled in.
Mm-hmm.
So if advocacy efforts end at, great, now the contract with Aramark or whoever has a contract to provide prison food, has been changed or terminated so that people have uh, edible food, and then we're going to just go home, that's, it's like that's not going to address the issue long term. But if it is something that people can do and they can be like, great, we did this, now what? you know Now what do we do? We are basking in this victory of, like, my loved one will not be eating moldy meat,
Mm-hmm.
or I will not be spending $200 a month for them to eat those beef sticks or whatever the heck, those jerky sticks, and crackers and chips and cheesy, those cheese whiz things at commissary because they're being fed moldy meat. It's like, this is a victory, and what is next? Because it can also build power, because people may not be immediately on board for fighting against a new prison, or like going to the legislature and lobbying for ending life without parole sentences, but they might be like, I don't, my loved one is relying on me to give them money so that they do not starve, because their other option is moldy meat. And it is something that you can, movements can build to build power, because then people can say, I helped do this. And especially for many families who do not have backgrounds in organizing and
Mhm.
activism and advocacy and have often been told that they are powerless to change anything, this is a huge difference to them. And for them to say, I can do something else. Maybe I can't put 40 hours a week into this, but I can call I now know how to call a legislator, or I now know how to use my story, or I now know how to talk to my neighbors and my friends and my community about this issue and get them on board. Oh, I can take half a day off and go to this rally over here, and be part of this. So I think in those ways we can say like it builds power
Mhm.
among people who are often thought of as powerless.
I guess specifically about American jail and prison, and I feel like jail is often not even mentioned, as it seems much more banal and like less dramatic and therefore less bad. But I will say that, like, for example, Rikers Island, my number one association with that is Kalief Browder,
Hmm.
solely from, well, initially one New Yorker article, and I believe he got 3 years for suspected theft of a backpack. 3 years, a lot of that in solitary. He was late teens, I guess.
Yes, he was. I think he was 16 years old, I believe. I could be wrong, but he was in high school, and he was accused of stealing a backpack, and he was denied bail and sent to Rikers Island. And he was on Rikers Island for 3 years awaiting trial
Mhm.
because he decided he was not going to plead guilty, even though the prosecutor said several times, if you plead guilty, you can go home. And he said, I didn't steal a backpack. I will not plead guilty. And so he spent 3 years in Rikers Island, which is a hellhole.
Mhm.
It has been a hellhole for years and years and decades. Not even years and years, decades and decades. It has been a hellhole. Various human rights commissions and, department, governmental departments and the Department of Justice have even said this place is a hellhole. It needs to be shut down. And what we see with Kalief Browder is a very stark example of A, jails are hellholes.
Mhm.
And B, people can be stuck there for years and years and years awaiting trial. So for people who are like, well, innocent until proven guilty, this person was placed in these torturous conditions, even though he was technically innocent until proven guilty. And he was released because the district attorney finally dropped the charges against him. So he didn't even go to trial and get acquitted. The district attorney realized that he was not going to fold, and they didn't have enough evidence to actually mount a trial against him because he would have won.
Mhm.
But the toll that it took on him was so horrific that he ended up taking his own life. So even though he, in a sense, won his freedom, the devastation of those 3 years at Rikers, being attacked by other people, being harassed by guards, being abused by guards, being placed in solitary confinement, which is imagine living in your smallest bathroom, for listeners who are outside the New York City area and may have more spacious bathrooms, your smallest bathroom, often with no windows. I don't recall if Rikers solitary units have windows, but who cares if they do? Because you probably don't see very much anyway.
Mhm.
Um, and just being in there 23 and a half hours a day, maybe even 24 hours a day if the guards don't feel like letting you out of your cell for your mandatory hour of recreation. And being there days and weeks and months and years on end. So this would devastate anybody's mental health. And in the case of Kalief Browder, it had a very tragic outcome where even though he was rebuilding his life, he got his GED, he was enrolled in college, he had like reconnected with his family welcomed him back, he still ended up taking his own life. And there are many other people who are at Rikers for months and years on end, waiting for trial, whose stories we don't hear about.
Mhm.
And one of the other things I want to point out about jails is that they are supposed to be for short-term stays, right?
Mhm.
Like you're supposed to have a speedy trial. The Constitution says thou has a right to a speedy trial. Nobody gets a speedy trial. It is not worth the piece of paper it is written on. But uh, so people are stuck in these jails that are not meant to have people long term. There are no programs, there are no resources, there's kind of nothing to do, when you're sitting in jail. And so people are spending all that time there. And many times people plead, I've talked to service providers who say that many times people decide to plead guilty so they can go upstate and start their prison sentences where they know that there is an end, but there are
Mhm.
also things to do there. And this is not to say prisons are so much better. They are not like Club Med or anything like that, but there are some access to some programs. You might be able to get into some sort of educational program or work program, or even just a recreational program that you can't do when you're sitting, say, at Rikers Island, where there is very limited ability to do anything. Like Rikers Island, until the past few years ago, did not have a library. Instead, it contracted. So you have people sitting there with nothing to do, which
Mhm.
is why my friends loved it when I brought books. My friends hated to read before they were incarcerated. They were like, "What are you doing reading a book? That's stupid." Like they would actually like tell me this. But once they were inside, they were like, "There's nothing to do here. Please bring a book. What are you reading? Sure, I'll take that." Um, and they would rely on uh, people from the New York Public Library and the Brooklyn Public Library to bring books on a book cart. And oftentimes, people who were the librarians from New York Public Library and Brooklyn Public Library would talk about how it was a crapshoot as to whether or not they would get in. So they weren't allowed to leave their books at Rikers. They had to bring a backpack full of books, so it was only whatever they could carry. And then they would sit at the gate. And if, say, somebody forgot to put in that the librarian was coming that day, they would be turned away. If something else was happening at the jail, like there had been a fight and the units were on lockdown, they would be turned away. There were some when they were allowed in, they had to put their books on a book cart. The books all got examined to make sure there was nothing illegal in them, like a knife or, a bag of pot or something else. And then they would put their books on a book cart. And if somebody was on a unit, say a solitary confinement unit, where you had to go up or down a flight of stairs, they could not go to that unit because they could not get the book cart up or down that flight of stairs. And because there was only one librarian, uh, they weren't able to hit all of the housing units. So they had to pick and choose. Somebody I volunteered with at Books Through Bars decided that she was going to focus on the one women's unit at Rikers Island, Rosie's, and then a few other of the buildings. Her predecessor had had different priorities and had not gone to the women's unit. So you could see how, it also depends on, like outside forces who
Mhm.
are sometimes not allowed to get in, sometimes can't get in. And you could still be just out of luck. Whereas at least the upstate prisons had libraries, where you could physically go to, and there was a variety of books. Some might be good, some might be crappy, but like that's just one example of something that Rikers doesn't have, even though it would be very simple to like have a library on, in each housing unit so that people had something to do. Because if people are reading, they are not getting into fights. They are not, deciding that they're going to make plans to like attack the guards and escape or,
Yeah,
cause
it's
mischief. They're just reading a book. So you would think even from a management point of view,
yeah.
that would be something to have, but it did not. So oftentimes too, service providers talked about people pleading guilty, which then means that they have a criminal record,
Mhm.
which will follow them and haunt them when they get out and try to rebuild their lives, just so they can go to the slightly nicer, or what they perceive to be a slightly nicer environment upstate that at least offered them something to do.
I do get the sense that people are actively punished for not taking a plea
Yes.
deal. Like if they want to even have their day in court, regardless of evidence or actual guilt, like if they won't take what's offered, they will get the harshest possible punishment for that. It seems like.
Yes. Yes. It is so common. It's actually called the trial tax. So if you take your case to trial, you will get a harsher sentence if found guilty than if you had just pled out in the first place. So
I believe there's this. I don't remember offhand, but the percentage of people in America who just take a plea is
it's
very high. I
it's
don't.
over 90%. Like some places put it at 90, some places put it at 95, some jurisdictions are even at 97. So this is
What a
bananas where we
joke.
have a giant carceral apparatus made up of coercing people into these plea deals and into accepting prison sentences when, if they had taken it to trial, perhaps they would be walking away.
I had forgotten that aspect of Kalief Browder's story, and obviously he was a victim of it, but I should remember the bravery and moral fortitude not taking a deal, when you're
Yes.
being pressed. That's impressive and terrible. And truly, that story alone makes me want to burn Rikers jam.
Mhm. Yes. But one of the reforms, like, and then we can move on to, other topics, that has been proposed that is a reform that people will then be fighting against was a few years ago in the few years before the start of the 2020 pandemic. There was a fight to close Rikers Island and build new jails in each borough-wide jails.
Mm.
So New York City has 5 boroughs, and there was a proposal to build one jail in each borough. Staten Island, the most Republican and conservative borough, said, nope, no jail for us, and backed out, and somehow nobody cared that they backed out, but okay. So then there were 4 borough-wide jails, and basically they were going to propose tearing down the smaller jails connected to that borough's courthouse and building much larger buildings, much taller buildings that would hold, that would incarcerate, like many more people than they were able to, with measures like bail reform, where basically more people would be able to go home without having to post bail, and measures like stopping the NYPD from practicing stop and frisk and
Mm.
arresting people, not arresting people for quality of life crimes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The number of people at Rikers would shrink down enough so that way those borough-based jails would be enough to incarcerate people awaiting trial. And then they would, I don't know, make Rikers into an airport, or something like that. Rikers is built on like a toxic sludge. So, I actually don't know what else you would put on it except maybe an airport. So fine. And there was opposition
Mm.
in many of the boroughs. Most people did not want a mega jail in their, in their
Right.
community. Some of it was from the not in my backyard people, but there were other people fighting against it, saying that this is not the solution. Why are we spending so much money building new jails instead of addressing the concerns leading people to incarceration? And the borough jail plan went through with the idea that Rikers Island would be shut down by 2025 or maybe 2026, something like this. Something around now.
Mm-hmm.
And and those borough-based jails would be the place where people are held pre-trial. And instead, what happened is the pandemic hit. New York City elected ex-cop mayor Eric Adams
Mm-hmm.
as mayor. He greenlit lots more arrests, lots more, incarcerations at Rikers Island. And so we have the number of people at Rikers Island climbing to the point where nobody would be able to safely be able to be put in these borough-based jails. But at the same time, the process has started for pouring millions of dollars into building these new jails, over the objections of the communities. And what we're going to end up with is, at the end of this, Rikers Island is still open, and we've got these new mega jails, 4 new mega jails, at the cost of I don't know how many millions of dollars that could have been funneled into resources that would have helped people not be criminalized,
Hmm.
not be in poverty, not experience violence, not experience homelessness, like all sorts of other resources that didn't get those funds. So that's an example of a reformist reform where people were like, build nicer jails and we'll close this hellhole down, not thinking like, well, A, maybe they won't close the hellhole down. And B, it's like what could be in its place instead.
Yeah. Another good example is I think more people in general have a more of a sense that solitary confinement is torture, but it was invented by Quakers who thought they
Mhm.
were being humane because it was a time for penance, not being, tortured, because we didn't know what that did to the brain back when that
Yes.
was first thought
Mhm.
up. So your reform can look like torture once we learn a little bit more about how humans work sometimes.
Yes.
I don't know if you were ever optimistic about a chance of reform in America, because to me, let's say circa 2009 to 2000, you could say 16, you could say even 2020, like there was a window where people were maybe on board, including some elected officials, and now it feels like there's a backlash to something we didn't even do. So like defund the police. Well, this was a terrible idea. Well, you didn't do it.
Mhm.
So this is not my full time worry at all, but I'm still deeply distressed by that, I think. And it seems like there was a second where we could have gotten a crowbar in there and maybe made some progress. And now we're back to American status quo in that way.
Yes. I mean, I think that you're right. Like between 2009 and say 2016, early 2017, there was this drive towards what was called in, more mainstream circles, criminal justice reform.
Hmm.
We saw that we had a president who, while he was the deporter in chief, and built up, the deportation machine that the Trump administration now gleefully uses, to deport everybody and their mother and their grandmother. um, we also saw that he was, pushing for limited criminal justice reform.
Hmm.
He had a mass clemency project, vowing to commute the sentences of people who had been sentenced to lengthy, if not life sentences, or virtual life sentences, meaning it's so long you may as well have gotten a life sentence. Like if you get an 80-year sentence, if you are not 16 when you got that sentence, most likely you will die
Hmm.
in prison. Um, and, so we start to see some limited reforms and we start to see other jurisdictions, whether it is states or counties, also starting to follow this lead of, thinking about limited reforms to what's happening inside jails and prisons. Who they should be incarcerating. Maybe we should not, we being like the country or the region or the state or whoever, incarcerate people for nonviolent low level drug offenses. And we start to see changes in policy and changes in practice based on that. But it is a very limited amount of reform. Still, it got people out. This is
Hmm.
not to undermine the fact that people who thought that they were going to die in prison got to go home, got to be reunited with their families, got to try to start rebuilding their lives, and did not think, I'm just going to die in prison. So, this is not to undermine that, but also to say there were a lot of people who were left out of these reforms. So, these reforms also not only excluded them, but sometimes also came at the expense of people who say were convicted of violent offenses. And, violence could be the difference between, oh, there's an example. It's sort of like when you break into a house, you can be charged with um one charge. I think it might be burglary, but it might be like a different term, which is considered nonviolent,
Hmm.
or you could be charged with another term which is violent. And and it is up to the prosecutor to decide which one you get. So if you get charged with crime A and it's a nonviolent offense, you might be more eligible for an alternative to incarceration, or like having your charges dismissed, or a lower sanction than if you are charged with offense B, which is considered violent, and you are excluded from all of these considerations, and you are also seen as more dangerous, and face a higher penalty and more time behind bars. So again, it leaves people out,
Hmm.
and it also allows them to become the scapegoats for uh, societal ills and for prosecutorial uh, discretion.
It's another example of the prosecutors having so much power, and that's something most people don't. I don't think they think about that. My understanding is also that, not to say that people who actually committed an act of violence, like, but sometimes my understanding is that you can get slapped with some very severe charges if you have a weapon that you didn't even brandish. At least with drug stuff, I know that in some cases mandatory minimums have piled up because someone had a gun on them during a drug sale, but they didn't actually take it out. So it's not necessarily even what it sounds like when you hear the charges people are getting hit with and stuff. But I do appreciate even some sort of normie reform-minded people, not reform, I keep saying that, but who were like, we have to address the fact that like the perfect prisoner who got slapped with 50 years for selling marijuana, he might exist, but there's a lot of other people, and you have to address that. It's, people who commit violence, you need to deal with their existence and ideally their return to society. And pretending that everyone in prison is a perfect prisoner in that way is not going to really help with that.
Yes. I mean, one thing that stuck with me is that years ago I saw Susan Rosenberg, who was a political prisoner, and was given clemency by Clinton
Mm-hmm.
on his last day in office. Like, she got some virtual life sentence, like 99 years or something like that. She gave a talk in Tennessee, and at the end there was a Q&A, and somebody said, well, how would you like it? You're advocating for the murderers and the rapists. And, how would you like it if they were your neighbor? And she said, well, the majority of people in prison get out of prison.
Mm-hmm.
So they will become your neighbor, And so would you like them to come out not having had any opportunities to transform themselves, but having been in a violent, chaotic, dog eat dog environment for decades, in which their responses to triggers, stresses, and perceptions of danger, whether they are real or not, is violence?
Mm-hmm.
Or would you want them to come home, with more tools, so that way they're not, these, like, they're not reacting as if everything is the prison yard, in which it's like you have to just immediately put your hands up and punch somebody in the nose. And it stuck with me. Like, yes, the majority of people in prison will be coming home.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we've been talking about people with virtual life sentence and life sentences, this is not the majority of people in prison. So they will come home. And do we want people to come home as, I don't want to say productive members of society, because that means that they would fit in this capitalist model, but as people who can be empathetic,
Mm-hmm.
sympathetic, and if not contributing community members, at least people who are not potentially threats to their neighbors and people in their community, because they have been conditioned by prison to react in ways that we would like them not to react.
We touched a little bit on the COVID times and health stuff, but I would like to talk a little bit about that most recent book, Corridors of Contagion.
Hmm.
And I remember hearing, occasionally people worrying about people in prison during the time, but like as usual, they were put far on the back burner. Can you talk about kind of what COVID did?
Yes. I mean, early on in the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, I think 8 of the 10 biggest outbreak hotspots were in jails and prisons. So I mean, it makes sense when you think about the conditions in jails and prisons and immigrant detention centers as well, where people are packed in tightly. There is no social distancing. At the start of the pandemic, people were not given masks. If they attempted to fashion something into a mask, like a bandana or, like an old shirt or something else, they were written up, meaning that they were given a ticket that would punish them in some way. Like, you got a ticket, you can't make phone calls for the next 30 days. You
Yeah.
got a ticket, you can't go out to the yard for 30 days. You got a ticket, you can't order off the commissary, which again, looking at thinking back to what we talked about earlier about food, many people rely on the commissary because the food is inedible and is often dangerous to eat.
God.
So getting a ticket is a big deal.
Yeah.
In prison, it also affects your chances of parole later on. If you have too many tickets, the parole board says we think that you have not learned your lesson. Go away and come back in 5 or 10 years, and let's see what happens then. So, not surprisingly, jails and prisons became sites of outbreak. And at the same time, there were efforts to have people who are incarcerated released
Hmm.
to prevent outbreaks.
Right.
And this happened in places like Iran and in Turkey. Keep in mind that Iran and Turkey are not places that human rights organizations and advocates are like, these are the pinnacles of human rights,
Yeah.
But they released tens of thousands of people from their jails and prisons because they wanted to avoid the kinds of outbreaks we started to see in the United States less than a year later, because prisons actually released fewer people in 2020 than they did the previous year.
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, if you think about that, that is bananas.
Mhm.
The number of people released in 2019 was 10% higher than the number of people released in 2020 when there was a pandemic happening. So that boggles the mind. It means the carceral apparatus was so set on keeping people inside without regard to their safety. And also remember, COVID-19 is an airborne virus, the safety of their staff, the safety of the communities where the staff goes home to.
Mhm.
So, like Tommy is a prison guard. He gets COVID-19. He brings COVID-19 in. So, he gets sneezed on in the supermarket or somebody breathes on him or whatever, and then he comes to work the next day. He's not showing any symptoms, whatever. But he's also maybe not wearing a mask
Mhm.
because the prison won't let people wear masks, or he's wearing it improperly, or he just doesn't believe in masking. He spreads it to everybody on the unit that he's guarding, and then he goes home, and then maybe a few days later he gets sick and he calls out. But in the meantime, everybody on that unit now has COVID incubating. And, Johnny comes in, 4 days later, gets COVID from everybody, goes home, has dinner with his family. His wife goes to work the next day. I'm going to just use a heteronormative scenario because also I do think that most prison guards live in heteronormative scenarios. But, just to make it easy, but also I think that probably is the case. So Johnny goes home, he has dinner with his family. The next day, his wife goes to work, his son goes to daycare, his daughter goes to school or some program, and they all start spreading the coronavirus, and then the community gets sick. There was a study, I think in 2021, that showed that communities in which prisons were located in had a higher rate of COVID-19 spread and outbreak than communities that were not affiliated in any way with prisons. And that's because it is not a virus that happens in one place and stays in one place. It goes in and out. So the carceral apparatus was willing to put incarcerated people at risk, staff, family members, and the communities that they were in at risk rather than releasing people. so that that way they could, if they had homes, go home and just hang out at home like many of us were doing
Mm-hmm.
to prevent getting COVID-19 and prevent spreading COVID-19 and prevent any other preventable or treatable illnesses that could come with getting COVID-19. So I think that that is a very damning situation in which all of these people were put at risk, again and again across the nation rather than letting people out.
I mean, I have to assume the status quo healthcare in these places was already
Yes.
substandard, shall we say. I don't know if that kind of exposed how they're already.
Yes. And what we saw later on, because statistics only come out like years after, the year that they were collected for, is that in 2020, prison mortality rate jumped 77% compared to 2019,
Good Lord.
and that was 3.4 times the rate of the general public. So you could argue, oh, there were more deaths in general, but no, outside of prisons, the death rate was not that dramatic. And so even though some prisons depopulated,
Mm-hmm.
or released people, even though the numbers of people in prison were lower than they usually were, the prison mortality rate jumped. And in the 19 states that identified COVID deaths as separate from other deaths, COVID caused nearly 1/3 of prison deaths. Then you could also say that like maybe people died because they weren't able to get timely medical care because medical staff were calling out sick. They were sick. They were dealing with patients who had COVID and weren't able to deal with people's other needs. And as you said, medical care in carceral settings was abominable, even without a pandemic bearing down. But the pandemic made things worse because it delayed treatment. And even more than the typical delays in jails and prisons. I interviewed one young man who had been incarcerated at a jail for a probation violation at the start of the pandemic. Who made this decision to send this young man to jail at the start of a pandemic? And who made this decision to keep him in jail when the pandemic hit? Somebody should have said, you know what, we don't need probation violations in this jail. He had a gunshot wound in his leg, not connected to the probation violation. Like he did not go to probation violation because he had a leg wound, but he needed daily wounds care.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody needed to clean it out in a very specific way and rebandage it in a very specific way. And he was getting that wounds care before, the pandemic really hit. Then when the pandemic hit, there was, a shortage of medical staff. People didn't want to do it. They were too busy. And so there would be a few days, here and there that increased in time where he was not getting that wound care and he got infections. And, it got worse and bad things happened. And in the end, he had to have his leg amputated. This doesn't show up as a COVID related,
Right.
you know, uh, a COVID related, I don't know, act of negligence, but it very well was,
Mm-hmm.
and this young man now does not have a leg, which was entirely preventable had he not been in jail, not been kept in jail, and if there had been medical staff willing and able to, treat his leg. But the pandemic decimated what was already a terrible, abominable medical system down to not even bare bones, because bare bones would have been he would have gotten wound care, worse than bare bones, whatever that, if any of your listeners have an idea as to what that phrase would be. But, and so what we see again and again is people are not getting the treatment that they need. And I mean, fortunately, he did not die from sepsis,
Yeah.
which also could have happened without that daily wounds care, but if he had died from sepsis, would he be considered a COVID related death? No. It would have been like, oh, he died from sepsis. We don't know what happened.
I'd have some questions if anyone dies of sepsis in a jail.
Hmm.
Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Is there something, so you can analyze America? Is there something uniquely vindictive about Americans in terms of criminal justice? Totally anecdotal, but I remember reading on Reddit about one of the so-called Manson girls who are always being denied parole.
Yes.
I don't remember which one it was, but she had served 50 years for
Mm.
participation in, a nasty murder, like some real harm was committed. But she was paroled after 50 years, and there was a comment that basically said, "Well, I just think she should have been punished." And it was sort of, what the hell do you think 50 years is? Like,
Hmm.
I don't think Americans have any idea how long a year is in prison or a decade. 50 years is basically life. She can be a 75-year-old woman now, and be free, and that's okay. But I
Hmm.
mean, what's wrong with Americans in this way? Is there something weird about us?
I think that we have been fed from a very young age this idea that, we need to lock up the quote unquote bad people.
Hmm.
And there's also this idea somehow that the quote unquote bad people are not capable of change. I mean, if we look at what happened, and I mean, what, happened in 1960, whatever year that was done by people who were in their 20s. Nobody who is in their 20s or nobody who is in their 70s is the same person that they were in their 20s.
Sure.
People in their 30s are not the same age as they were when they were in their 20s. I think 10 or so years ago, there were studies that came out that showed that the human brain is not fully developed until the age of 26. So this idea that when you are 18, you are magically, fully accountable and responsible for all of your actions is false.
Hmm.
We should not be like, like being like, yeah, you're 18, you're, fully responsible for all of your actions. You should try to be responsible for all of your actions. But if listeners think back to what they did in high school, they might be like, oh, can't believe I did that,
Hmm.
and maybe it wasn't real harm. Maybe it was like being mean to like, the unpopular kid in class or hiding somebody's pencil case or something like that. But, still they'd be like, I wouldn't do that today,
Right.
like as an adult. So I think that we are fed this idea that there are bad people and the bad people need to be locked up and they need to be punished. And we have a very punitive society because this is what we are fed from the very beginning.
Hmm.
And then we were also fed all sorts of propaganda or propaganda that says that the cops are your friends. I mean, there is this show, Paw Patrol, which, is dogs that are cops that is wildly popular with the very young children. The parents put it on because that's what they're clamoring for. And there's not an analysis, that's like, gee, are we feeding our kids propaganda? They're like, I need to make dinner, go watch TV. Here's Paw Patrol. I need to do this thing. Like you want to watch Paw Patrol, fine. But from a very young age, we have this idea that the cops are our friends, and then you buy into the carceral apparatus because what are cops here to do? The cops actually don't uh, get kittens out of trees and like help old ladies across the street and make sure people have groceries. They are there to arrest and punish. So you start to buy into this mindset. And then we just have decades and decades and decades of politicians and media and community leaders, whether it's a church or this or that, being like all regurgitating these ideas about like if you do the crime you should do the time, like this person is bad, this person is a monster. And it's also an othering of people,
Hmm.
and it's an othering of people that are seen as disposable, because we also have to remember who is hardest hit by the carceral apparatus. It is not the well off. It is not people on Jeffrey Epstein's list.
Right.
It is, who are the rich and powerful and pretty white people. It is people who are low income black and brown people, people with very few opportunities, people who it is easy to other, and to dehumanize and to see as monsters. in the 1990s, the term super predator came out
Mhm.
to talk about young people who were committing these horrific acts of violence. And they didn't mean, like the the white kids that were, running around, vandalizing things in the suburbs. They, were really trying to scare people into thinking that there were hordes of black and brown children descending upon nice white people and, committing horrific acts of violence, and it worked.
Mhm.
So we have this idea that, like, there are bad people. There are bad people and they don't look like us. These bad people who don't look like us don't think like us. These bad people who don't think like us and don't look like us should be punished. And these bad people should be punished for eons. We want them away from us and we don't want them in nice circumstances. So it's not like, oh, we just want them to go away. They can have their own separate state or their own separate island or whatever. It's like we want them to be punished
Yeah.
for their actions. We want them to be punished because we are afraid. And why are we afraid? Because we have been taught to be afraid, not because, there's actually something to fear.
But that's the strange thing, is that to be sort of charitable towards the fear of crime, again, unless you're locking everybody up forever, you're actually making it worse, because you're putting people in this situation of constant fight or flight, having to get in fights, don't have good food. I mean, it seems sort of obvious that to reduce the harm for literally everybody, you give people a library and real food and stuff. But like this deep desire for punishment, like people get mad that that asshole in Norway who did the mass shooting, mostly of the teenagers, that he has what to us looks like a very comfy prison. And like, I'm not super upset that that guy is being treated humanely, even though he's a terrible dude. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that some people who have never suffered any violent crime, I haven't, I think most people I know honestly haven't, there's this deep desire for punishment and quote unquote like justice.
Yes. But I mean, also, you have to remember that this idea of incarceration as, punishment or, safety occurs only after harm has occurred.
Right.
So in cases of violence, like, if you talk to somebody and you ask them, if you walk down the street, would you like the scenario to be that you are not attacked at all, or that you are attacked, but the person who attacked you is going to suffer the rest of their lives?
Yeah.
Like most people are like, no, I actually just don't want to be attacked. Thank you very much. I would just like to walk down the street, minding my own business and not deal with this. And I think that, it actually is, like, so this idea of like punishment happens after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
And one other thing to remember is that I think something like half, maybe a little bit more than half of people who have experienced violence at the hands of other people do not report it to the police. So we have to remember too that this is not everybody, who wants punishment, because there are people who get mugged, get robbed, get attacked, whether by strangers or by people whom they know, who are sexually assaulted, and they do not call the police. They are not actually seeking retribution. That also means that they will not be entitled to the minimal crime victim services that the carceral apparatus offers.
Yeah.
I mean, and I say that because the carceral apparatus is not like a social services agency. So they always talk about the victims, but what do they do for the victims besides haul them up on the witness stand to testify? They're not like, oh, gee, like you can't pay your bills for 10 months, let's help you with that. Oh, you need therapy because now you are afraid to walk down the street. You
Yeah.
need, like they're not interested in doing that. There might be some places where they have better services than others, but still 50% or more of people who have experienced violence do not call the police. They are not seeking that kind of retributive justice that the carceral apparatus offers.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to also remember that people who are like, lock them up, throw away the key, more punishment, are not necessarily the majority of people who have experienced violence.
Yeah. I don't want to ask you to verbally like solve all the problems in criminal justice. But I'm curious what you picture a solution might be to the extremely anomalous, like I'm going to have to use Ted Bundy or someone, like someone in the midst of a spree killing, like people who are actively dangerous. They keep committing violence. And there's like in sort of a short amount of time. Like, I mean, do you picture like I would say like a better mental health system, a non-coercive one, which is my preference? I mean, do you like for these are the anomalous cases, but I don't know if you have any idea what that could look like in an anarchist.
I actually don't.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see is that, like, like with somebody like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy or whatever, is that there were failures at so many points
Mm-hmm.
to intervene before it got to the serial killer
Mm-hmm.
point, and I think both of those men also came from like solid middle class backgrounds, from what I
I
understand. I
think
think
so.
John Wayne Gacy was like some sort of like community political leader or something like that. I do not follow serial killers, so I like actually don't pay very much attention to like, who they were before,
Mm-hmm.
they were arrested. But what we have to think about is there were places, so many places in which maybe somebody might have said, hey, this behavior is kind of problematic. What are we going to do about it? How do we address it? Maybe we need to bring his parents and his extended family in to figure out what, is going on with little Johnny or little Teddy or whatever, or not so little Johnny and Teddy,
Mm-hmm.
like, but what were the places in which early behavioral warning signs were ignored? What were the places in which it was like, boys will be boys, which is something that is said, particularly when white boys act in ways that are inappropriate and potentially threatening?
Mm-hmm.
What are the ways in which there were failures? And then how do we make sure that we don't replicate those failures again and again and again? I mean, we also see this with the white boys that do school shootings.
Right.
Like what were the warning signs, for middle class white students who are, you know, getting guns and doing school shootings? Like what was missed earlier on? What was missed 3 days before they did this?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think so. I don't have a solution as to like what do you do in the aftermath, but I do say like if we were looking at how do we want to prevent harm, we also need to say like what are we missing,
Mm-hmm.
earlier on that could have been like points of intervention, where somebody could say, hey, this is not a good idea, or hey, we're noticing that, you know little Timmy is, or not so little Timmy is, exhibiting some behaviors, and maybe we should like keep our guns locked up.
Yeah.
It's like even something like that. John Wayne Gacy is, having some issues over here. And instead of being like, boys will be boys, or, oh, he's only always been a like this, that, or the other, been like, let's perhaps dig a little deeper and figure out if an intervention is necessary, or, how to approach this so that way somebody doesn't get hurt, or we don't find out that they killed 50 people and, put them in the refrigerator.
I read a thing once, and I swear this is very rarely mentioned, talking about how we're underestimating how many people in prison and jail have probably had a head injury in their life. And certainly the anomalous, truly like epically violent people, sometimes we know somebody had a head injury as a child. So, like, there are things we don't know how to fix, but we kind of sometimes know what happened and why they are a danger. So, but like, if you can't even give someone, like a tampon in prison, we're not going to be able to figure out, oh, you have these behaviors. Perhaps you had a head injury in your youth.
Mm, yes. Well, I think also what we have to remember, and Danielle Serid, who is the founder and director of a group called Common Justice,
Mm-hmm.
which is a non-punitive alternatives to incarceration for young people ages like 16 to 24 facing violent felony charges in New York City. So it is like the population that people are screaming most
Mm-hmm.
about. Said it, put it as, nobody is introduced to violence by, first doing violence. In other words, people who commit acts of violence have had violence committed onto them before this, so this is not their introduction to violence, is going and hitting somebody upside the head. It is because somebody committed violence onto them, and there is unresolved trauma, behind this. And so it's also like, what happens, like with, whether it is a head injury, whether it is because somebody was abused, whether it's because somebody was sexually assaulted and never reported it. There have been some studies, sort of piecemeal, like in California and in New York, where this was specifically in women's prisons, where like something like 75% in New York and 93% in California of women who killed someone said that they had been, someone close to them said that they had been abused by that person. So
Dang.
again, piecemeal, also self-reported, but still very telling. And then there have been other studies that show that like something like over 86% of incarcerated women or people in women's prisons have reported violence in the, being recipients of violence or survivors of violence in their past. And when you think about how people who have endured family violence or partner violence, might react to a stranger with a clipboard being like, have you ever experienced family violence? Have you ever experienced partner violence? They probably will not, be as forthcoming. And what we also have to remember is that survivors of violence, of family or partner violence, have been conditioned to not say anything. So the number is probably something much greater. But 86% of people in prisons, in women's prisons slightly higher than in men's prisons, have reported to the person with the clipboard that they have experienced violence in their childhoods or earlier adulthoods from someone who was close to them. So I think we also cannot discount the fact that people in prison have also been victims. They are not always just like the scary monster perpetrator.
I feel like the conservative framework, conservative in the way that America just is, family violence, partner violence stuff that's like, part of your private life, because it's private and it is harder to sort of help stop, and people, as you say, don't want to talk about it. But we get this framework where like an uptick in shoplifting is treated as this terrifying epidemic of lawlessness, and yet conservatives don't want to touch, like, the family tends to be the place for violence. And I'm not saying it's easy to actually try to fix that, but they don't even want to kind of acknowledge that much worse violence. I mean, it's not even violence, but like the worst stuff is usually going on at home. And I don't quite know what you do with that, but pretending that, CVS is in mortal peril is not actually doing much to protect people.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, it's that like mass panic, but it's also what is it called? Like, when a magician is trying to like do a trick and they want you to look at their hands, but not at their,
like a sleight of hand, or
sleight of hand. Yes. That sleight of hand that redirects people's fears from being like, like, what are the actual sites of violence and what are the interventions necessary? And in the case of family violence and partner violence and domestic violence, it is not a carceral response. The sleight of hand is to be like, look over here, the CVS has been looted, you will not be able to get your toothpaste today, more at 11 type of thing. And it's like, not like, like over there, we hear that somebody, we hear that violence is happening behind that closed door because everybody can hear it, but nobody knows what to do about it. And there is not necessarily like a push for resources, a push for approaches so that everybody can stay safe. But staying safe might also be that like they are apart. Again, to use like a very heteronormative situation, maybe the reason why, the wife does not leave her abusive husband is because there's no place for her to go. Or I interviewed one woman who, I think she had 4 children, and she was trying to leave her abusive husband, and the shelter she contacted said you can only bring 2 of your kids.
Jesus.
So what was she going to do? Leave
Yeah.
2 of her kids there?
No,
So
she's
she
not.
ended up staying,
Yeah.
and I think she was charged with failure to protect later on, which is a law that says that, like, if somebody's abusing your children and you do not intervene, you have failed to protect them, not taking into account that most likely you are also being abused.
Yeah.
So like being like, hey, maybe we need to have places where people with larger families can go. Okay, fine, that shelter only had like room for 2 kids, but what the hell? Maybe all the kids can just sleep in the same bed. Who cares?
Yeah.
Why have this rigid policy? Be like, hey, we can only like house you for this long, but you're in an emergency situation, and then we'll figure it out. Why are there not places for people who have 4 kids?
Mm-hmm.
What if you had grandma and you don't
Mhm.
want to leave grandma in the abusive situation? Like, are they going to say, no, we don't really take grandmas? Sorry. So again and again, we see that like these types of situations are unresolved and continue on, and those are actual acts of violence. But the sleight of hand is the CVS.
Mm-hmm.
We need to put more police around the drugstores because they're getting shoplifted.
Theoretically, that's an easier fix on its face, but like it's also not. I hate to keep using sort of affluent white boys as my example, but I would love to free the Menendez brothers from prison, and I believe their stories of abuse. But like, I feel like we haven't even begun to think about like child abuse and the love and loyalty that children frequently have towards. I mean, it's like what you're raised from birth by your abuser.
Yes.
Like how can you possibly untangle the psychological mess that is, and how can you not sympathize with somebody who started off that way?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot harder than adding a second security guard to the CVS, but that's not any fun. So
No, it is not.
I don't know if this is too grand, but like, what do you think you're doing here with your career, and what do you kind of hope you're doing with this focus? What would be a goal that's perhaps realistic?
Well, I started writing specifically about women's incarceration in the early 2000s when there was not a lot of attention
Mm-hmm.
being paid to women's incarceration. And so I wanted to highlight not only conditions that were not really being thought about or talked about, except in small circles that were working around women's incarceration, but also the actions that incarcerated women were taking to challenge and change these conditions. So, not women as passive victims,
Mm-hmm.
but women as people who were challenging and acting as agents of change. So, that was my original intention. And over time, I expanded my focus. We as a society, or we as some parts of society, started understanding that there were trans people in prison,
Mm-hmm.
and that, and then this was a bigger issue than just like one trans woman over there, one trans man over there, one gender non-binary down south someplace, but actually like this was a larger issue that was not getting very much attention, except for the very, very tiny slivers of people who were focused on criminalized trans people,
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, like, not Caitlyn Jenners or Jennings or whatever her name is, focused on the criminalization of trans people and the fact that trans people had a greater proportion of being arrested and jailed and criminalized because of their gender identity. So these were, like things that I like expanded to look at, what was happening in immigrant detention, and how were people resisting and organizing there. And so what I really wanted to do is highlight not just the conditions that people and injustices, but also what people were doing to change them. And that meant like doing a lot of listening, doing a lot of talking, or doing a lot of questions, not talking, but, questions to be like, that actually does sound like organizing, even if on the inside people are just like, oh, yeah, we just mass filed
Mm-hmm.
grievances. Grievances are complaints, official complaints to the prison. And if you do a mass filing of them, if, say, everybody in a housing unit files them, the prison sits up or the jail sits up and takes notice because they're like, oh, it's not just Kim Jones that is, filing this, and whatever, Kim Jones is a whiner or a
Hmm.
complainer, but it's everybody on Unit 32A that has filed something. Maybe we might need to change something. Oh, wait, now they filed another round of complaints. Yeah, we need to do something, if in the prison administrator's mind, only to keep from getting another round of complaints. So, like, looking at some of the ways in which people resisted and organized in women's prisons, it looked very different than in
Hmm.
men's prisons. Like, it might be women who mothers tended to be the primary caregivers of their minor children before they were arrested and incarcerated. And so they were more likely to have their children end up in foster care and in the child welfare system. So it might be women sitting in the law library helping each other with, being like, this is what this means, this is what you have to file, this is how you can prove to the courts that you were trying to stay in touch with your child, even though the foster parents will not pick up the phone, will not accept your collect calls, or returning your letters, and you're not able to communicate with your child. These are the ways in which you can still demonstrate to the courts that you are doing your very best despite being incarcerated. So to ask the courts to please do not terminate your parental rights. Because another fun bill that Clinton signed into law in 1996 was the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which says that if a child has been in foster care for 15 of the past 22 months, the state should be starting proceedings to terminate the parent's legal rights. And that termination is irrevocable. So it doesn't matter if the parent gets out of jail or prison 2 months later and it's like, hey, can I get my kid back? They're like, you know,
That's
your rights have been
an
terminated.
insane rule to have written. So, like, that sounds like something that you need every single individual case to be judged. Not.
Yes. Yes. So I wanted to highlight these ways in which people were organizing, because this was not something that was necessarily being looked at by people who were advocating for prison reforms, for prison abolition, just in general, so like I wanted to bring attention to not only these stories, but also the efforts of incarcerated women and formerly incarcerated women. And, I gradually expanded to people of other genders, Now, sometimes I even write about cisgender men in jails and prisons.
Every once in a while. Okay. I would love to do a a lightning round to wrap up, if I
Sure.
may.
Mhm.
Um, and the first question is optimism or pessimism?
That is very hard. I'm going to just say optimism,
Okay.
because if I was pessimistic, I would do something else with my life.
Fair enough. Cats or dogs?
Cats.
Okay. The first stop in your time machine?
Oh, I would say 2100. Let's go see what the future holds.
Nice. People rarely go forward. Favorite fictional justice system?
Favorite fictional justice system. Mariam Kaba wrote about a justice system in the Feminist Utopia Project, and I would go to that.
Best concert you ever attended?
The Cure 1990 something, 92, Wish Tour.
Very good. One underrated thinker and one overrated thinker?
Oh, that is a good question. I'm going to pass on that because I can't actually think of anything in a lightning round.
Fair enough. And do you have a strategy for staying? What's one strategy for staying productive?
Oh, that is also a very good question. Making a to-do list, because then it breaks everything into a smaller, more manageable bunch of tasks.
And the final traditional question on this here podcast is: how would I get a cappuccino in your imagined political utopia?
You just snap your fingers and it would appear
I
in
mean,
your hands.
that is utopian. I'll give you that.
Mhm.
Um, another. Do you have any media recommendations for people more interested in this subject we've discussed?
Yes, I would say the news website Truth Out,
Hmm.
has been an excellent place. Interrupting Criminalization, which is not media, but is a website and has all sorts of resources on how to address issues without criminalization, from like healthcare to like when you see somebody in crisis to bystander intervention to doing restorative justice. So excellent resource for people who want to know more about this. And then, of course, I write many books and articles about what's going on behind prison walls. And just as importantly, what people behind the walls are doing to challenge and change these conditions.
And speaking of your work, where can people find you on the internet and where can they get your books?
Okay, so I'm at victorialaw.net, and you can find my books either directly from the publishers, which are on my website, Haymarket Books, Beacon Press,
Love Haymarket,
New Press, PM Press, or your local independent bookstore if you have one. If not, bookshop.org is an excellent alternative
It is.
to the evil Bezos empire, and I strongly encourage people to buy off Bookshop and not evil Bezos.
All right. As usual, listeners can find Non-Serviam on various social media sites. Blue Sky, Mastodon. I don't remember if we're still on Twitter, but hopefully not. Listeners can follow me on those places as well. You know how to do that. Victoria, this was really enlightening and inspiring, and I appreciate you coming on today.
Yes, and indeed, thank you for, covering these issues, and thank you for having me on.
All right. You're listening to the Non-Serviam Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot. And you can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.